Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm starting the series on the King's Indian defense with the introductory video on the basics, in which I'm going to cover the main variations, main plans for both sides, the ideas behind the opening, and basically all the main things you have to know if you want to start studying it, or if you are lacking some basic knowledge and already playing it. This is the first video and the first opening in the D4 series. As you know, I have finished the E4 series, and with the King's Indian, the D4 openings are starting. It's going to be a long series. I would say more than 100 videos. The E4 series ended just around 100. So yeah, I'm going to be covering every single variation of every opening, and hopefully it will be useful and help you broaden your repertoire. The King's Indian is probably one of my favorites, which is why I chose it to begin with. It's an extremely interesting opening, very flexible, very aggressive, gives black a lot of chances, and it's nothing like those openings which you see on the highest levels today. It sort of goes against what the top 20 or top 50 players in the world play with black, because it's not an opening you play to go for a draw. It's an opening you play to win. And basically, if you see the King's Indian on the board, you know that it's a very tactical, aggressive, fighting player who doesn't wish to draw with the black pieces or isn't satisfied with the draw with the black pieces. Before I begin, I would just like to mention the strongest players of all time who played the King's Indian, whose games you should study if you want to get familiar with the opening, because as with any other opening, studying grandmaster games should be one of the first things you do. The opening wasn't really as popular at the beginning of the 20th century. Only when David Bronstein and Isaac Boleslavsky started playing it and started developing the theory, it became recognized as a normal mainline opening which you could use on the highest level. So those two Soviet players were the first to help contribute to the theory of the King's Indian. After them, Svetozar Gligoric, the Yugoslavian grandmaster, contributed a lot. Miguel Najdorf, the Argentinian Polish grandmaster, who also, of course, developed the Sicilian Najdorf. And to end with, definitely Bobby Fischer, who is the greatest player of all time ever to have played the King's Indian, and it was his main opening against D4. After him, Garry Kasparov, and before him even Mikhail Tal. So you can see that one thing that these three great players have in common, that they were all considered to be attacking geniuses, and they didn't really want to go for a draw. Bobby Fischer and Kasparov and Tal went for a win in every single game. So if you're looking for an opening to win with the black pieces, then the King's Indian should be your weapon of choice. Okay, now the opening starts after the moves D4. And black plays knight f6. Two main moves against d4 are d5, which is considered to be the classical approach, and knight f6. d5 used to be the main response in the classical era of chess, when it was considered that you need to take the center. And the King's Indian and the other openings branching out of knight f6, which are considered to be the modern openings, sort of go against that principle, which is why the King's Indian wasn't really popular up until the mid-20th century. So knight f6, c4, white continues in the classical principle, taking up central space, g6 for black, knight c3 for white, and bishop g7. After knight c3, black can still play d5, entering the Grunfeld, but if he plays bishop g7, this is now the King's Indian defense. The main feature of the King's Indian defense is that it's a hyper-modern opening. What does that mean? Black is conceding central control to white. Black is allowing white to expand in the center as much as he'd like, to take up as much space as he'd like, to control as many squares as he'd like, and in most variations, as we are going to see, white is going to be controlling f5, e5, d5, c5, and b5, which is a huge number of squares in the middle of black's position. So from a classical chess perspective, this position is already losing for black, which is why it was considered dubious for a long time. But as we are going to see, black plays this way with a clear purpose in mind. Same as with other modern and hyper-modern openings, such as the Pirc or the modern defense, black allows white to expand in the center just to be able to undermine that center afterwards. So the main idea of the King's Indian is to strike at white's center, to counterattack, to open up the position, and to make white's position crumble. White's most principal move here is to simply take the center with the move e4, and black's only response is the move d6. And this is where the King's Indian starts. You could call this the starting position of the King's Indian. So now the main idea for black is he's going to castle fairly quickly. So you can see that the black king is already tucked away on g8. Black has already obtained a lead in development, while during the time black was developing, white was taking up space. So white lacks development, but has more space. One thing that needs to be highlighted is that if black manages to destroy white's central control, then he is going to be ahead in development and simply better. The engines never understand the King's Indian, same as they don't understand the Peer's defense or the modern defense. They just love space. They love the fact that white has more space for his pieces, more squares for his pieces, and more activity. So the evaluation the engines give about the King's Indian is never objective. That's, well, in the case of the King's Indian, you shouldn't really listen to the engines. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, since this is only an introductory video, I'm going to be mentioning the main variations and we are going to look at them briefly just to give you an introduction about each one. And each one is going to be covered in a separate video or even in several separate videos, especially the classical variation. Okay. Let's start with the Fianchetto variation. After d4, knight f6, c4, g6, there is one way white can play if he wishes to avoid the main lines of the King's Indian. You could enter the Fianchetto variations from the lines with knight c3 as well, and they often transpose, but the main way to enter the Fianchetto variation is knight f3, bishop g7, g3. And the point of this is that white is of course going to copy black and fianchetto his light squared bishop. After castles, bishop g2, d6 castles, you have the starting position of the Fianchetto variation, where you can see that the king side position is symmetrical. Both sides have fianchettoed and played g3 and g6. The difference is that white has the pawns on d4 and c4, and black has a pawn on d6, which means that black doesn't have the advantages he normally gets. He can still try to undermine the center, but the main theme of this position is that the king side attacks black usually goes for don't really work, as we are going to see in all the other variations. If you look at the normal King's Indian position, the main idea for black is to play either e5 or c5, undermine the white center, and then when, let's say, e5 happens, regardless of what white does, black's next move is going to be c6 if white continues with d5, and black is slowly going to gnaw away at white center and try to undermine it with one goal in mind. Black wants to move his knight and play for a kingside attack, while at the same time white wants to go for a queenside attack and try to gain space and gain piece activity and gain even material on the queenside. The Fianchetto variation doesn't really allow that. The Fianchetto variation goes against the normal King's Indian style of play, as in black doesn't go for a kingside attack because it's really hard to storm white over with the pawn on g3 and the bishop on g2. So if you're looking for a calm variation to play against the King's Indian, then the Fianchetto variation should be your weapon of choice. Now let's look at some of the main lines. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, the starting position of the King's Indian, and now white's most principled response, e4, taking up space in the center. After e4, black plays d6, preventing an early e5, and also supporting the moves e5 and c5, which are his main breaks. And white continues with knight f3. Knight f3 is the orthodox or the classical variation, and it's by far the most popular move, and you're going to face this probably 70% of the time. This has been played 22,000 times, and from the move knight f3, all the main variations branch out. The next two moves are forcing, and they occur in every single game. Black castles because he has to castle. White plays bishop to e2, and black plays the move e5. After the move e5, you have the starting position of the orthodox King's Indian, and a position that has been on the board 20,000 times, and it's one of the most thematic positions in all of chess. Here, white can branch out. The main move is castles, but there are also positions with bishop e3, which is called the Gligorich variation. There are positions with d5, named after the great Tigran Petrosyan. This is the Petrosyan variation. White can also opt to take on e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and this is the exchange variation. As we are going to see, it's not really smart to take the e5 pawn. So all of this we are going to go over in great detail. But mostly we are going to be focusing on the main line with castles, because after castles, knight c6, d5, chasing the knight away to e7. This is called the Mar del Plata variation. You have the most thematic variations of the King's Indian, namely the bayonet attack with b4, which is considered to be one of the main lines. You also have positions with knight e1, which is well, this is the classical system. Knight d2 is the modern system. Bishop g5 is another aggressive variation. This is called the Aronin-Taimanov variation. And we are going to cover all of these. So from the classical King's Indian, there are so many possibilities and there are so many chances for white and for black to gain something out of the opening. And the sad thing is that you have to know all of them. Basically, if after the move c4, g6, knight c3, you play bishop g7, then you need to know all of this, which is why we are going to cover all of them in detail, and I'm going to try to give you detailed explanations of each one to make sure that you don't get into something which you are unfamiliar with. So let's continue. e4, d6, knight f3, the classical, castles, bishop e2, e5. Castles is the main move, knight c6, d5, bishop knight e7, b4, let's say the bayonet attack. And here you see the main features of the King's Indian, and this is one of the most thematic setups. Of course, the King's Indian can have several different types of centers, as we are going to see. Black can, instead of e5, play c5. An exchange can happen on e5, which means that it's a semi-open center. In the Fianchetto variation, you're going to have a sort of Morozzi bind centers. And there are several possible types of centers which can occur in the game, but this one is the most thematic one. And the main theme of the opening is that black wants to play f5 and attack on the king side, and white wants to play the move c5 and attack on the queen side. If you remember the middle game video I made on pawn breaks, you always want to break on the side that your pawn chain is facing. So for black, the most obvious pawn break is f5. For white, it's c5 in this position. And the bayonet attack is the most beautiful example of that. Knight h5 is the main move, with a clear purpose of simply freeing up space for the f5 pawn. Rook e1, f5, and black has already achieved something. And here you can see the advantage of the Fianchetto variation for white. It would be really hard to create attacking chances if the pawn was on g3 and the bishop was on g2. But in the normal King's Indians, this is extremely dangerous. The engines, once again, don't really like black, but these positions are venomous. Both sides have to be extremely precise, and every single tempo counts. So this would be the equivalent of the Sicilian in d4 openings, and probably one of the most complicated variations, one of the most complicated openings you can play. Okay, so that would be the classical. So after e4, d6, you play knight f3. And if you play the King's Indian, this move you are going to be facing the most. The second most popular move is f3, after d6, pawn to f3. This is called the Sämisch variation. It was named after Friedrich Sämisch, and this one often leads to opposite side castling and very aggressive play. You can see that it resembles the Yugoslav or the English attack, positions which white often plays against the Sicilian dragon setups, where black fianchettos and castles short and white castles long with f3, bishop e3, queen to d2 castles, and then going for g4, h4 and stuff like that. So the Sämisch reinforces the center and prepares for a kingside onslaught on black. It doesn't allow black to go for a kingside attack while white is maneuvering, attacking on the queen side and stuff like that. The Sämisch is, in my experience, the worst variation for black to face. Just to give you a sample variation, black castles, bishop e3, c5, black needs to go for his break, opening up the center, knight g2, e2, knight c6, d5, knight e5, knight g3, and here we come to the point which I wanted to mention earlier. In closed center positions in the King's Indian, where black has played e5, his next move is going to be c6, undermining d5, and in positions where black has played c5, his next move is going to be e6, undermining this structure. And often after, let's say, bishop e2, ed5, cd5, you are going to have a Benoni type weakness on d6, so this is something you need to be familiar with. And this is just one sample of the same-ish, the way it could go. So you can see that it's very complicated and it doesn't really resemble a normal King's Indian. Another variation I'm going to cover in detail is the Auerbach variation, where after d6, white continues with the move bishop e2. And this move has one clear purpose in mind: to stop an early e5 break from black. We are going to see how. Castles, and black continues with the move bishop g5. Now the move e5, even though it seems normal, cannot be played here. The normal move is c5. After c5, d5, h6, bishop f4. Black is once again going to continue with the move e6 in most positions. But if after bishop g5, black goes wrong with the move e5, now white is in fact winning. The reason for that is slightly far-fetched, but you have to know the position basically to know it. The point is that there is going to be a fork at the end of the line. d5, queen d8, rook d8, bishop f6, and now the winning move is knight d5, forking the c7 pawn and the f6 bishop, and it's simply game over. There's nothing black can do about that. So the move bishop e2 castles bishop g5 in the Auerbach variation is aimed to stop e5. So black goes for c5 and now d5. And this is considered to be slightly advantageous for white, and I think that the variation is fine. We're going to look at several ideas of how black can fight that in the detailed video. And the last variation I want to cover is after d6, visually the most aggressive move f4. This is the 4 pawns attack, and this is white basically going all in, telling black, you play the King's Indian, I'm going to play the 4 pawns attack and crush you. So this is the most aggressive variation white could choose. Let's say castles. Knight f3 is the main move here, visually most appealing. Once again, e5 is a clear proof of how overextending against the King's Indian can cost you the game. Let's just look at one sample variation. Let's say e5, which is a mistake. D takes e5. You don't want to take with the d pawn, of course, because black takes the queen. So let's say f takes e5, which looks visually most appealing. Knight d7, and it seems that white is gaining a lot of space. Let's say b4. But now f6, another strange looking move, because e6, it's chasing your pieces further away, but knight b6. Let's say d5 gaining more space, c6 once again undermining the position. Let's say bishop to b2, it looks like a very principled move. cd5, let's say cd5, and now f5. And this position is already busted for white. There are a lot of chances for white to go wrong. If I turn on the engine, it says that it's more than -1 for black, so black is winning. So there are a lot of traps that white could go, that white could enter if he doesn't know what he is doing. So after castles, e5, even though it looks visually appealing, is not a move. Knight f3 is a move. c5 once again trying to undermine the center. d5 closing the center. e6 once again trying to gnaw away at the center and trying to undermine it. So the 4 pawns attack, even though it's visually very attractive, visually very aggressive, I think that it is overextending for white, and I think that white should know his lines perfectly. So if you plan to play the 4 pawns attack, you should be thoroughly prepared. We're going to cover that in a separate video, don't worry, and I'm going to show you. In fact, this is one variation which I'm going to highlight because I think it's a great weapon to have in your repertoire. Okay, so to conclude with, the King's Indian is a very flexible, very aggressive, and very fun opening to play. You should choose it if you want to play for a win against white. It has been played by Fischer and Kasparov and Tal and most attacking geniuses of the 20th century, so it cannot be a bad opening. Remember not to listen to what the engines say. Their evaluation is almost never objective. Okay. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I've missed something or if I failed to mention something, some variation which you would like me to cover. Thank you very much for the comments. Thank you very much for the support, as always, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.